Well, in the previous couple of discussions, I've talked about terms of trade, deterioration, and their consequence for Africa specifically. We saw how across the board in terms of African production of coffee or cocoa or bauxite or aluminum or cotton, we see a more or less steady decline in terms of trade, so that the amount of goods being produced may go up considerably, but the actual value that an African nation is receiving for those goods declines markedly. So if we keep the value of a dollar steady to 1 year, mark it as one base year. Here's the value of a dollar in 1970, and transform all the values, 1970, 75, 80, 85, and so on, to the value of the dollar in 1980, that in point of fact, African nations are receiving a half or a quarter or even a sixth of the value for what they are producing in the year 2000 as in 1970. That's deteriorating terms of trade. If we had produced a similar chart for the countries of Europe selling goods to Africa, or America selling goods to Africa, we would see not a decline for the most part, but a rise in the price of the goods being sold to Africa, keeping the dollar value constant and so on, as we did with the African nation products. Just to give you a sense of the overall quantities of wealth that we're talking about, this is some research I did, it's a way back, 20 years I'd say, but still relevant and giving a sense of the magnitude that we're talking about, the magnitude of wealth we're talking about. Again, this follows from the year 1983 to 1992, the declining terms of trade for all underdeveloped countries. The United Nations has a body called UNCTAD, United Nations Trade and Development, United Nations Commission for Trade and Development, and they develop statistical evaluations of all sorts of trade-related questions. And so using this chart uses as an index year the year 1980. And it says if the average value of a product, a commodity produced in an underdeveloped nation in the year 1980 is 100, and if the average commodity produced in the developed nation is 100 in the year 1980, then here's how the average commodity price goes up or down from 1983 to 1992. So here is the index which represents the value of the commodity produced in the developed nations. So again, 1980 is 100. By 1983, it's 101, and it goes up in 1992 to 113. So whatever was the average commodity in 1980 stood at 100. By 1992, it had risen to 113. And here is the export index. So again, 100 is the base year, 1980. By 1983, it had already fallen to 92. In 3 years, it went from the average commodity produced in the underdeveloped nations stood at 92. It had fallen to 92, and by 1992, it stood at 86. By the way, look at this. Try to figure it out. If I'm going too fast, I ain't got no feedback from you. There's no way using this mechanism that you can tell me, I don't understand it. Well, the information is here, and see if you can figure it out. If you don't understand it, I bet you could figure it out if you put your mind to it. I'm not going to explain all the different steps I took to get to this point, but the upshot is this, is that because the price of the goods that underdeveloped nations are spending for the goods that they're buying from the north, from the developed nations, because that's increasing, then each year, if we kept the base value of the good at 100, this is how much is the underdeveloped nations have to pay more than what they would have paid if the goods produced by the developed nations had remained constant in price rather than having gone up. So by the year 1992, the underdeveloped nations are having to pay $67 billion, $67,853,000,000 more for the goods produced in the developed nations, because those goods have gone up in price than they would have had to pay if those goods had remained at the same price that they were in 1980. And similarly, this is the loss caused by this deterioration in how much underdeveloped nations are receiving for their commodities. The loss in 1992 stands at $87,318,000,000. If the underdeveloped nations had been able to maintain the price that they received in 1980 for the goods that they were producing, the average price that they made for the goods that they were producing in 1980, then the underdeveloped nations would have received $87 billion more for the goods that they produced and sold to the developed nations. So anyway, the upshot is this, that if you take all the increased costs that the underdeveloped nations have to pay because the developed nations' goods are rising in price, and if you add to that the total loss to the underdeveloped nations because the price of goods that they're producing is going down, the total is $908 billion over a 10-year period lost to the underdeveloped nations. Another way of saying that is that the underdeveloped nations have subsidized the developed nations to the tune of almost $1 trillion. Over a 10-year period, the underdeveloped nations have paid an additional almost $1 trillion because of the deterioration in the terms of trade. We will continue with yet another mechanism in the taking of wealth out of third world, underdeveloped nations in our next. Sumarera, Obagora. There, Obagore.